Good morning. Today is June 26th, 2025, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler, David Schraga, and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everybody who negotiates. As you may know, there's no charge for these great programs. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And since we began the series in 2020, our audiences have been so generous in contributing in honor of our great speakers. David Schraga, would you please do the honors and tell us just how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks around the world?
Good morning, Jeff, and good morning to our audience and speaker today. It is my singular pleasure to tell you that as of today, this program has raised $829,221.34. That is just an incredible number. It's millions of meals. There's a tremendous multiplier effect for every dollar that you contribute. And it looks like today, Steve, you'll be pushing us over the $830,000 mark, I would say.
Fabulous. Steve, that'll make you the answer to a very popular trivia question at bars and pubs around the world from now on. Anyhow,
Another milestone.
Let's talk about the presentation. It's great to have a real friend and a real pro presenting to us, Stephen Bierman. Steve is an independent arbitrator and mediator, formerly one of the leaders of Sidley Austin LLP's New York litigation group for 25 years. He's going to talk about strategic preparation to optimize mediation outcomes, practical tools for mediators, counsel, and parties. What I think we're really going to learn today is the benefit of all of Steve's experiences, both as an advocate and now as a mediator, practical insights we can all bring to bear. Steve Bierman, please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're able to do so, and then on with the presentation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and what a privilege to be joining you and colleagues and everyone who's here, and to be able to support the important mission of the Will Work for Food project. My selected donee is City Harvest, which is based in New York. My entire litigation career and my post-litigation career as a mediator and arbitrator has been based in New York, although it's been national. And City Harvest is a wonderful organization that many years ago had the idea of rescuing nutritious, good, quality food from otherwise being discarded from restaurants, from stores, from other locations and purveyors, and gathering all this food and then distributing it to what is now, I think, more than 140 food banks in the New York area. They also are engaged in food education programs and advocating for putting an end to the food insecurity issue in New York and in the country. So I encourage you to support City Harvest. So as Jeff said, on with the show. So as Jeff kind of previewed, I'm going to share my personal experience and my own perspective as to the importance of preparation and the right kind of preparation for all participants in mediation, and some practices that I have found especially effective on my own journey from a longtime litigator to becoming a mediator and on. Let's briefly set the stage with a plain truth. Preparation matters in life. It always does. Benjamin Franklin is famously credited with saying, although there's some controversy as to whether he's really the one that said it, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And the great storyteller and great trial lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." And we all know that preparation is the cornerstone of successful litigation practice. A lawyer prepares extensively for briefing, for oral argument, for deposition, and for trial. In-house counsel for a party, and sometimes key business executives themselves, prepare alongside as they would for anything important. But mediation is a different kind of animal. How do participants in a mediation prepare, and do they give as much attention to preparing as they would for any other dispute undertaking, such as trial? As a mediator, I see a wide range of preparedness of lawyers and clients who, with some frequency, unfortunately seem to be inadequately prepared. My own experience, I'm confident, is echoed by that of many other mediators. But to check the anecdotal against empirical evidence, I turned to the true expert on all things, AI. I asked Perplexity, is there any data about mediator and mediation preparation? Responded at great length in about a half second, citing to papers. One of the advantages, I think, of that particular platform is they will cite authority that they rely on. And in this case, it included papers by Professor John Landy of the University of Missouri. And in one of those papers, John in turn reported on empirical data collected by Art Hinshaw and Roselle Whistler. And here's the essence of it. Multiple empirical studies and surveys indicate that both lawyers and clients are often less prepared for mediation than for trial, despite the fact that careful preparation for mediation is strongly correlated with better outcomes and higher satisfaction for all parties involved. For example, a survey of mediators across 8 states found that only about 2/3 of mediators in civil cases and 39% in family cases held substantive pre-session discussions with parties or their attorneys in their most recent case. And that mediators in these surveys perceive that only about half of the parties are adequately prepared for mediation, even though the vast majority are represented by attorneys. So we're not imagining that the participants often approach mediation in varying states of under-preparedness. Well, so what? What are the consequences of insufficient preparation? Well, for clients, for the parties, well, they may not understand the process. They may think it is unfair as it unfolds on them for the first time in the mediation session. They may become frustrated and dissatisfied in a mediation session, and they may not have the mindset as a result or the tools to consider a consensual resolution. And inadequately prepared lawyers may come to the mediation thinking that it is just the next battlefield in a long land war. They may cling to their litigation positions rather than explore and embrace their clients' deeper interests and objectives, and thereby they may actually undermine the prospects for an acceptable solution. In essence, without suitable preparation, mediation can be frustrating and can end in failure. So over a long career as a practicing litigator and trial lawyer, I fell somewhere along the mediation preparedness spectrum. In the relatively early days of mediation, and yes, I know it's hard to believe, but I go back that far, we didn't really do so much. I made sure I knew my case. I knew I could articulate my client's positions. I spent some time with the client strategizing, but often the client and I rapidly agreed that the other party was simply unreasonable or worse. And when the calendar said it was time, we went to the mediation. Some succeeded, some did not. As I gained experience and mediation practice itself evolved, I came to realize the importance of not just knowing my case, but also assessing strengths and weaknesses, making sure the client understood the mediation process and previewing how it would unfold, working with the client to identify the party's business and settlement objectives, and developing a negotiation strategy as opposed to let's just show up. Some clients, bless them, were all in with these subjects and were willing to spend the time and to partner in planning. But other clients, and bless them too, were not. They didn't want to hear about vulnerability in our position or risks or costs of continuing litigation. I hired you to win, And you told me I would win. Now, of course, I didn't tell them they would win, but that's kind of what was in their head. And with those clients, the discussion sometimes would devolve again to how unreasonable the other side was. And let's go show them a thing or two and see how that goes. In some cases, we succeeded. In some cases, we didn't. With at least some clients, I could have used the help, no matter how experienced, some help rather, no matter how experienced I was. I would characterize the mediators that I used as a litigator in the three categories that we're all familiar with, from Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Some were too hot. These were what many people would call the head knockers, who knew their mind and expressed it with blunt force. Some were too cold. These were the passive water carriers, conveyors of messages between the parties with little real substantive contribution. Both the too hot and the too cold mediators typically had, at most, non-substantive pre-mediation session contact with us, generally regarding scheduling and process. But then there were the mediators who fell into the just right category. They showed interest. They conferred with us before the mediation session on a range of subjects, and my client and I would move forward better prepared for potential compromise. The true aha moment came for me about 8 years ago when I was still practicing as a litigator, and about 4 years before I retired from Sidley Austin. And I see, by the way, one of my former partners on the screen, Rob Olian. Hello, Rob. In any event, I had been hired to represent a very prominent global law firm, which itself was a defendant in a complex and high-profile lawsuit involving multiple claims. We went to mediation with an excellent mediator who engaged meaningfully with us and with both sides in advance. And the mediation sessions were paced and they were protracted. When there was a lull, I would ask the mediator why she was doing this or that, or framed a question or an issue in a particular way. She answered me, but she said, you know, Steve, you ask a lot of questions, and they're good questions, but really, you should just take the mediator training and complement your practice by mediating. And so I did take the training thinking, well, I already know everything, but let's see. And it turned out I knew far from everything. It was as if the scales were literally lifted from before my eyes. I wished I had taken that training earlier in my litigation career. It would have helped me better serve my clients. And now, some years later, here we are. So why am I sharing my backstory, my journey from litigator to independent mediator and arbitrator as well? Well, I've come to know that my experience and my perspective on mediation as a litigator are not uncommon. And I have come to know that there often is a disconnect between the principles on which mediators are trained and what many counsel, and even more so, many parties think about and expect from mediation. So how can that gap be bridged, and how can all participants better prepare for success? For me, the answer lies in thoughtful, strategic preparation by all involved, counsel, parties, and yes, the mediator too. And in my observation, in addition to the obvious kind of homework that goes along with that, the key to good and successful preparation lies in effective communication. What I now try to do as a mediator to enhance preparation by all participants, including me, stems from two broad observations. The first is that it is critical that counsel and parties understand that mediation is not another combat operation in the longer litigation war, but instead it is a pause aimed at forging a potential compromise acceptable to everyone. An attitude adjustment from combativeness to a resolution mindset is crucial for both counsel and their clients, the parties. And as I will explain in a bit, I think the mediator also needs to make adjustments in each and every case. The second broad observation is that the nature of mediation itself and how it is effectively practiced has changed over the years. While some disputes and disputants continue to be well served by a one-off event the mediation session for many disputes, particularly more complex matters. Mediation no longer is a one and done. Instead, it is a process with powerful potential for important progress before the grand event itself. Let me expand a bit on these observations. As to adjusting the mindset of counsel and parties, I think we all, as those who are here who are mediators, have seen this. Some counsel adopt a combative attitude, little different from the attitude they display in court or in arbitration. Litigators are trained to win, and they want to win. That's what they know. And getting the next case is how many define their success. And winning means, to some counsel, showing the other side at all times how tough they are, how right they are, how strong their position is, how hard they will make it if the dispute continues. And consistent with that persona, that armor, some counsel feel a need to impress the client with all of these martial demonstrations, and some fear that the client will think them weak or feckless if they let up in any way. That combative approach often leads to counsel negotiating through the lens of their steadfast, unwavering litigation positions, rather than trying to understand, to focus on, and help achieve their client's real objective. That is, what the client really needs in order to reach an agreement. And that combative attitude of some counsel not only can be counterproductive, but it can spill over to the client, to the party, who as a result may lack a nuanced view of the matter, may become reluctant to give an inch, much less consider what really may be required to reach a suitable negotiated outcome. Joan Stearns Johnson, mediator and professor at the University of Florida, Levin School of Law, wrote a wonderful article several years ago called Winning in Mediation. Joan reflected on on a couple recent separate conversations with two experienced mediators, she said, who had the same lament about combative counsel who do not grasp the difference between other aspects of litigation and mediation, and accordingly come to the process with a less constructive mindset. In fact, I had an uncredited cameo because I was one of those two mediators with whom Joan had talked just the week before she wrote this. Joan made the perceptive observation that many counsel misconceive the notion of winning in mediation, in the mediation context, and they think of success as pummeling, that is, besting their adversary in this forum as in any forum. Winning, if the term is relevant at all in mediation, should be assisting the client in achieving the client's objectives in a potential settlement satisfactory to all parties. That's a win, and it's a win for both sides, the proverbial win-win. You may say, well, lawyers are ethically bound to zealously represent their clients. And of course, you would be right. But I submit that a lawyer can fulfill that obligation while striving to assist the client in identifying what the client really needs and in representing the client in a way that helps achieve and fulfill that need and objective. So with the value of potential attitude adjustment in mind, I think it becomes clear why viewing modern mediations as a process culminating in one or more mediation sessions rather than as a one-off event can be so important and so helpful in many mediations. I'm referring, of course, to the effective and strategic use of joint or ex parte conferences with the mediator ahead of the mediation session itself. In my view, and I think I'm not alone, mediation begins when the parties select a mediator or one is assigned, and such conferences with the mediator count with quotes around it and can make, as it turns out, all the difference. For this reason, Professor John Lanty, whom I mentioned before, writes, and I agree, that we all should stop referring to these as pre-mediation conferences. Instead, they are pre-session conferences, or I might offer preliminary conferences. We're all steeped in referring to them as pre-mediation. And I think as time goes by, if we can train ourselves out of that, that would be a good thing. Well, whatever we call it, it's all mediation and all in the service of a potential resolution. I came across an article from 2012 from Alternatives, the excellent journal of CPR, which is edited by Russ Bleemer, who's on the screen here with us today. It's a journal of the Institute, the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution, whose mediation committee I co-chair. The 2012 article gingerly proposed that to enhance preparation of all participants, mediators might confer with counsel and parties more often before the mediation session. Well, why gingerly? The article noted that just 10 years earlier, in 2002 or so, substantive ex parte contact between the mediator and counsel and their client, with their client, was often frowned upon by some, and some thought it was improper. The article acknowledged that even in 2012, excuse me, sorry. Even in 2012, such contact was not fully accepted or encouraged. Think about it, 2012, Barack Obama was starting his second term as president. Doesn't that seem like yesterday in some ways? But since then, such communications increasingly seem prevalent. And but the data that I mentioned earlier, as that data shows, it's still not fully the norm. So with these principles in mind, my observations that mediation is different from courtroom combat, and mediation can be seen as a process and not a one-off. What do I do as a mediator to support effective preparation by participants, as well as my own preparation? So upon being engaged by the parties or assigned by a court in a Coordinex program or a provider, I set up an initial conference with all counsel, typically on Zoom. At that conference, I want to learn and accomplish several things. I ask counsel to describe their claims and defenses, where the dispute or the case stands, and any previous efforts at settlement. Kind of obvious. I ask whether there is information that might be exchanged to better inform the parties' potential settlement. Again, kind of obvious. I may ask whether counsel are comfortable sharing in that setting any insights they may have as to potential obstacles to settlement, or regarding the dynamic between the parties, or cross-cultural considerations at play, or whether they would rather discuss that with me separately. I ask about the parties and the counsel's intentions regarding the conduct of the mediation session itself, and we do some scheduling. I may speak briefly about my own philosophy and approach to mediation, but as this is a party-driven process, I do not dictate how that process will take place. I ask whether they or their clients have ideas as to how I can be most helpful as we shape a process together that suits the parties' needs and expectations. As to process, for example, we may explore the potential value and content of a joint mediation session before caucuses, at least for me to meet everybody, to set a calm and optimistic tone, and go over some ground rules for the day. Now, I am well aware that the use of joint sessions has withered substantially or disappeared altogether in some practice areas. I'm looking at you folks from California, in some parts of the country in any event, which I believe in some instances is just progress, but it also may be a lost opportunity for direct dialogue, particularly between parties, and for tone setting at the least. I find that most counsel these days, even the most civil and collegial, demur at making any substantive remarks in joint session. And they say some variation of, it will just poke the other side in the eye. My response is, now here's an idea. Why don't you say something to the other side that does not poke them in the eye? Look, the parties are in dispute. They are in conflict. They are in a lawsuit. They do not see eye to eye. None of that's a surprise. Well, sometimes that encouragement lands. Other times, perhaps many or most times, not so much. But I explained that I may raise important questions or issues or I may have thoughts to share with each side about the dispute or about the risks involved, but that I never want to get in the way of or to usurp their role as counsel to develop with their client's negotiation strategy and to conduct a negotiation, whether directly with me as kind of a chaperone or through me in successive caucuses. I test the waters regarding suitable preparation. Depending on counsel's appetite, attitude, and what seems to me evident level of experience, I might tell on myself a brief version of the story I just shared with you. How, as a litigator, I eventually learned the importance of thoroughly preparing myself and the client and what that means, and of leaving one's guns at the mediation door. We discussed the utility of a mediation statement and whether it might be exchanged or instead submitted to me ex parte. We have the same discussion about poking the other side in the eye. And I share ideas about how it differs from a motion or trial brief and what would be really helpful to include so that I can be better prepared to help their clients and to help them. All of that builds at a minimum some rapport and trust, and it supports the notion that we are constructing something together. I also strongly encourage that each side have a further conference with me without the other side, again, typically on Zoom, and that would include both the lawyer and the client, rather than just counsel privately. Sometimes I elaborate why right there, and sometimes I do so on a separate call with each counsel. But basically, I explain that what I found is that such conferences can be efficiently and economically handled because some lawyers are thinking, and their clients may think, ka-ching, the price is going up. But it is time well spent, and in the long run, it is money saved, and it is success more likely ensured. But in any event, I talk about how it can be done efficiently and economically. And I talk in terms of further building trust, ensuring party familiarity with the process, encouraging the party to identify their objectives, candid assessment of strengths and weaknesses, and setting expectations. In fact, including the mediator at that stage can substantially help can help the counsel prepare the client, as hearing some things from the neutral in a private session may resonate more than from counsel, who may be reticent to say them. That's the help I was referring to earlier that sometimes I could have used when I was a litigator. Sometimes counsel wants to talk with me without their client, perhaps to share an insight about the client's mindset, an emotional overlay, or an obstacle to overcome, or a cultural or cross-cultural consideration that is important to bear in mind. I welcome such contact with counsel because it can help inform the framework most conducive to a potential settlement. What I most want to encourage is conferring with counsel and their client. I don't insist on it. I don't make a requirement of mediating with me that we have these pre-mediation session conversations or sessions, because as I believe that as mediation should be party-driven and not mediator-driven, parties get to decide how they want to proceed with the mediator's guidance. And there are, simply put, some cases when multiple conferences might just be too much, or there might not be an appetite for it for various reasons. But I do encourage meeting with each side, lawyer and client, whenever appropriate. So when it happens, what do we discuss? I ask the client, the party, or the party representative to tell me a little bit about themselves. And if it's a company, to tell me a bit about the company. I am genuinely interested. I am constantly struck by how amazing the lives and experience of so many people are. Making that human connection and showing interest, genuine interest, not feigned interest, can help build rapport and trust. We may talk about the background of the dispute and the claims or defenses as part of my education and their organizing their thoughts. But what I really want to get at is to get beyond the legal posturing to what may be the parties' true ultimate needs and interests. So I don't use those mediation lingo terms as such. But I ask, what are you really after here? What do you really expect? What may look like an acceptable resolution? And how can we work towards that potentially? Is it just monetary? Or is there a non-monetary or a relationship aspect? Are there creative ways to go about potentially broaching a resolution? We discussed the mediation process, and I want to be sure that they understand what they can expect, both so that there'll be no surprise later, and so that the party and the lawyer will have a stake in framing that process. I mentioned earlier that in addition to the importance, I think, of attitude adjustment for counsel and the parties, the mediator too needs to adjust in each case. And I said I would come back to that. So here I am. And here's what I meant by that. Some mediators may say, this is what I do in mediation. It's what I always do in mediation. And it generally works. Or the mediator may think, without saying it, I've seen this movie before, and I know within a margin how it's going to turn out, or in my experience, how it should turn out. I submit that such mediators themselves need an attitude adjustment. There are overarching concepts and principles, to be sure, that guide all mediation practice, but each mediation is different. Each has unique legal and factual issues, unique interparty and interpersonal dynamics and emotional overlay, financial, non-financial, and relationship drivers, and different definitions of what is a successful outcome from two or sometimes multiple perspectives. So while I have, to be sure, my views and suggestions about process, I ask counsel, and whenever I have the opportunity to be with outside counsel and their client, I ask the client, and especially if it is in-house counsel who's familiar with mediation to some extent, how can I help? What do you think would work here? How can we best design together a process that maximizes the prospect of resolution? Let me give you a couple quick examples. I've had counsel or a party share with me in this context that while an initial substantive joint session may not be productive for reasons we've discussed, please, mediator, tuck away that at some later point after caucusing, it may be helpful for you as the mediator to bring counsel together or for the principals to speak directly. And they'll explain to me why that is in their case. And just the other day at a meeting of an ADR provider at which I was making a presentation, the senior in-house litigation counsel at a very prominent company told me that she often wants to speak directly with the opposing party or its principal, if it's an entity, at the outset of the mediation session. She wants to look that person in the eye and say, look, we disagree, but I hear you. And I want you to know that I respect your circumstance and I respect your perspective. Let's see if we can work something out. That acknowledgement, that olive branch can go a long way for what are obviously very human reasons. But as she told me, more than one mediator has said, that's not the way I do it. We're not going to do that. We're not going to have that direct contact. So I was kind of astonished by this. Really? Whose mediation is this? So I make a point to always ask about lawyer and party expectations and input on process. I've moderated several panels on ABA or provider programs where we assembled consumers of mediation services, both in-house and outside counsel. We asked the panels about mediator selection. What do you like? What do you not like? What works for you in the run-up to mediation and the mediation itself? And what doesn't work for you? What do you find to be successful techniques of mediators and what not so much? One of the questions in one of these panels was framed in terms of pure mediator lingo. Do you prefer, as a user of mediation, do you prefer a mediator with a more facilitative or a more evaluative approach, or some combination? Now, look, my own observation is that these distinctions that were taught in mediator training are not so hard-edged as may appear, and there's a blurring between the two. I mean, for example, even if you take a facilitative approach, when you are reality testing, when you're asking questions, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Embedded in that is an element of evaluation, if nothing more. In any event, so we asked, which do you prefer? What do you prefer? And the response was illuminating on at least one of these panels. On one panel, the very sophisticated in-house litigation counsel, and there were several of them, responded in unison, in puzzlement. What are you talking about? We're not familiar with those terms. What we want is a mediator that will beat up the other side. So some mediators attending this program were a bit aghast. This is heresy. But you know what? Others, including me, and I'll point out, including Jeff Kachavan, who was in attendance, thought, this is great. This is really interesting. It's really useful to hear. It's more than that. It's really necessary to hear. Mediator training notions and principles may not always match up with the practical experience and the needs of mediation consumers, including very experienced folks whom we hope to assist. I am minded, speaking of Jeff, I am minded of something that Jeff has said that I think perfectly encapsulates how each mediation is different and why, through preparation and effective two-way communication, the mediator needs to adapt, adjust, and customize the approach in each case. Jeff says that lawyers often will tell him, this was different from any other mediation I've ever attended. To which Jeff responds, yes, it's been different from any other mediation I've ever attended as well. And that's what I aspire to have be the case. And I encourage us all, whoever are mediators here, to aspire to. So in a pre-session conference with counsel and client, I also try, in addition to the matters we've been discussing, I also try to learn about the dynamics of relationships, interpersonal issues, cross-cultural considerations, and potential obstacles to settlement. What are the prevalent emotions? And I give folks a chance in that setting to vent if needed. I spoke on a panel late last year in New York about how to mediate high conflict, high emotion disputes. And my fellow panelists were a very experienced employment mediator, a very experienced family law and divorce mediator, and I was there as primarily a commercial business dispute mediator, although I do other things as well. And my colleagues spoke at length about how in their kind of cases, they're rife with emotion. They're very, very high emotion, and emotion, how they manage emotion, how they let some of the steam vent, and how they try to not let it overwhelm the process. And then they turn to me. I think imagining that I would say that it was somehow different in business cases. It's not. Every single case, in my observation, involves emotions. Every single case involves, after all, conflict, and conflict is stressful. And people are disappointed with how something worked out, and so they're emotional about it. So there's a place in learning about the parties and their circumstances and their perspectives for understanding that emotional overlay. Dwight Eisenhower famously said, and he was talking in the context of battle, but I think it's appropriate here, that in the event itself, plans may become useless, but planning is indispensable. I asked counsel at these sessions, and I asked the client at these sessions, their client, to consider what twists and turns the mediation may take notwithstanding all of our preparation, and to help prepare them to react to them constructively when the time comes. A preliminary conference with counsel and client also presents, I think, a tremendous opportunity to get them focused on the strengths and weaknesses of their positions, the risks and costs, if not settled, and a frank assessment of prospects. In addition to some preliminary reality testing or kicking the tires, I may suggest several tools that they could utilize in their own discussion, which can be done with me, but need not be done with me present. So these include, for example, thinking about a basic or even a more advanced risk analysis or decision tree kind of analysis. If properly done, a risk analysis can be a powerful tool to reset expectations in a concrete and more realistic way. I have found asking parties and their lawyers to think about what really do you think is the likelihood that you will prevail on some pre-trial motion practice. What is the likelihood that you will prevail on some or all claims at trial? What is the likelihood that the plaintiff will get what they're demanding or the defendant will walk away with nothing? And what do you think, if there turns out to be an appeal, is the realistic likelihood of the outcome of that? I remember when I was a litigator, clients always wanted to know, what are my chances? Is it 90%? Is it 95%? And I would struggle continually with telling them what I think they wanted to hear. I wanted to be a straight shooter and tell them the truth. And it was hard for me ever to say anything is more than 60% or 70%. And often it was a toss-up, and often it was an under 50% prospect. But clients always wanted to have the confidence that their lawyer was committed and that their lawyer was going to win. But I found that when you unpack that with counsel and client and their client, and you come up with realistic numbers, before you know it, the plaintiff should not expect to get all that the plaintiff thinks they will receive. And the defendant should not expect to walk away free. It is a sobering reality check, and I've seen it work again and again. So I commend to the mediators here and counsel who are here and anyone in-house who's here. I commend that tool. I may suggest ideas for assessing the value of the case. That can range from a realistic confrontation of what's being claimed and whether it's viable or not, to engaging an expert in a really complicated, really high monetary stakes case to help with that analysis, as opposed to hiring the expert a month before you are required to disclose who your expert is. So there's a lot of ways to do that, but I encourage people to think about ways that they can really value on each side of the V, the case. I may suggest that if it hasn't happened yet, that they have a frank discussion about the legal fees and the costs that can be anticipated if settlement is not reached. I never want to be lecturing anyone. I never want to be putting the lawyers in an uncomfortable spot. So I'll tell a story on myself quite often in this process. I might say, for example, that no matter how I tried in projecting budgets for clients who always wanted that, there was all the dark matter, the interstitial, I should say, the interstitial time between major events that ate up a lot of time. And I'll say, you know what? Not once, never and not once, when I was sitting there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning working on a brief, did I say, yay, more for us. I was just doing my job, and it took the time that it required. So I encourage a frank conversation about what it's going to cost as an alternative to the parties settling. I might introduce, depending on the audience, I might introduce the concepts of BOTNA and WATNA, the best or the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. I won't dwell on it at that stage. But I'll encourage the lawyer and the client to think about that in their preparation for what they will expect. I'll encourage the lawyer and the client, the party, I keep saying the client, I hope it's clear it's the lawyer's client, certainly not my client, to develop a negotiating strategy tailored to their assessment of risk and cost, potential outcomes, and what the client really needs in a satisfactory settlement. In their doing so, I will ask that they put themselves in the other party's shoes. That other party that is so unreasonable, that we don't like, their lawyer's a jerk, whatever it may be. But there almost always are really two sides to a story. One of the things I learned definitively when I put down my cudgel as a litigator and took up the olive branch of being a mediator. So put yourself in the other side's shoes. What are they after realistically? What do you think they need in order to have a satisfactory outcome? So you may be thinking, Steve, this sounds an awful lot like the initial caucus or the initial couple caucuses with each side in the actual eventual mediation session, the grand event. Well, yes, but also no. My aim is not to prematurely mediate the case, but instead to enable the participants to engage in smart, strategic, useful preparation on both sides. To do that, I plant some seeds, the kind of things I've mentioned. I raise some of these ideas. I motivate further thought and analysis. And I don't declare to anyone how they have to think or what they should do. I'm facilitating an environment and a context in which we can potentially see an effort to collaborate towards a solution. I leave some work to be done without me, often a lot of work to be done without me. And in the process, I also continue to build rapport and trust. As I've said, this process I've described doesn't happen in every case. It may not be suitable in every case, and sometimes it just isn't the appetite for it or for the full extent that I've described. But when parties and their counsel are receptive to working with the mediator in a meaningful way before the mediation session itself, whether in the way I do it or in the way other mediators do it, but where participants accept the opportunity to make that happen and are committed to it, it can be, in my experience, transformative. Parties and their lawyers come to the mediation session with a more constructive, resolution-minded attitude. They have reasoned through and puzzled through, in some cases, what the parties on both sides really want, and at least somewhat have reset their initial expectations, perhaps more realistically, because they've become comfortable with what the process will be at the actual mediation session or sessions, and because I enabled or tried to enable them having a stake in developing it with my guidance, perhaps, there are no surprises procedurally. They come to the mediation session with a strategy rather than what I described in the early part of my career as a litigator. Let's just see how it goes. Because this advanced work was done where it is done, the mediation itself, in fact, may move more briskly and more productively with a lot of time saved, because these concepts that I've described in this talk don't need to be unpacked for the first time in the mediation session. And you run less of a risk and less of a likelihood of frustration, the lawyers, and more particularly the parties hearing some of these ideas and tools for the first time. You run less of a chance of it just blowing up. In short, when the parties, counsel, and the mediator, him or herself, come to the table better and strategically prepared, the mediation, frankly, is more likely to succeed. With no guarantee that it will, but we're always trying our best to make it more possible, more likely, that success can be accomplished. And so I'd end with this. With apologies to the late author Herman Wouk and his epic World War II novel, War and Remembrance, which if you haven't read, I commend to you just as a reading experience. It well may be said that the beginning of the end of disputes lies in preparation. So thank you so much. I appreciate you being good listeners. I hope you have been active listeners. And if anyone has something they want to share about what they do or what they think works or how they prepare, or if anyone has questions, or Jeff, you want to, and colleagues, you want to discuss anything, I'm all ears. But thank you.
Steve, thank you. That was a very well-prepared talk. We appreciate that. A very mature and very comprehensive approach to how to be effective as a mediator. Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I'm sure people have comments or questions. Let's just open it up. You can either type your question or comment into the chat or simply unmute yourself and pose your question or make your comment. Please go ahead.
Well, let me actually, I just glanced at the chat and let me commend to you all. I see that David posted in the chat that the aforementioned John Landy will be speaking to this group in 2 weeks on July 10. I know I'll be attending because I've heard John speak any number of times. He is truly a leading authority and thought leader in the world of dispute resolution and mediation in particular. And I always learn something from him. And he's always learning something new himself and passing it on. The latest thing I know he's been working on and thinking about is the integration of AI into the practices of mediators. I don't know what he's going to talk about, but I'm sure
That's exactly what he's going to be discussing with us in 2 weeks. And I agree, Steve. He's a terrific thinker and speaker, and his presentation is going to be just as worthwhile as yours just was. Bernard Morrow, your hand is raised. Please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. And Steve, thank you very much for an excellent session. I agree with Jeff. It was very well organized, and your thoughts were clearly articulated.
thank you.
So I mediate civil disputes. I mediate other sorts of workplace disputes that are non-litigious. I find that in the non-litigious world, there is a great openness and appetite for pre-session discussion. I find in the litigation world, not so much. During COVID, I started doing pre-mediation conference calls. I started first to do it as a pilot to see how it would go. And then with success, I started to do it across the board. So I do it consistently with counsel. I have those meetings. What I find is that there are those that are very much they've bought into the process, and then there are many that are resistant to it. I speak to counsel, clients of mine, they go, why do you do this? You could put your questions in an email and we can provide answers to you. We don't need to have a call. And I think there's something missing here. I believe that a big part of my success now comes from having implemented this process as part of my mediation approach. But there's resistance, and lawyers are in constant tension, I think, with the mediators. And I'm a lawyer, like many of you, to maintain control over the process. What do you think? How do we deal with that resistance?
Well, first of all, congrats on trying and succeeding whenever you can. I think that's terrific, and I think not to cast to paint all litigators or all lawyers with the same brush, but I think it's partially that a control thing. I think it's partially just an ingrained attitude about the process. But I think more than anything, it's lack of exposure to good mediation practices. It's a relatively recent thing in the last maybe 10, 12 years that you see more programs for litigators, how to be effective at mediation, how to prepare, how to act in the mediation. I've been on panels at some of those programs. I think they're terrific. I wish they had existed back when I was stumbling my way along and learning. But I think, apropos of my little anecdote, that I went to the training that that wonderful mediator had said, listen, just go take the training already. Thinking, I got to do that to become qualified, but I won't learn anything. Wow, was that an eye opener? And I think the same reaction would be common among many litigators if they were open. So the way I try to broach it is, when I have the chance, it doesn't have to be in the formality of perhaps the kind of sessions I was describing. I'll have a phone call with the outside counsel just to talk about some of these things. And again, I use my own experience to kind of tell a story on myself rather than hector any counsel or preach to them. But you've hit on a real challenge.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute left. Anybody else?
Steve, any other tips or suggestions in terms of things that you see lawyers maybe doing wrong that you're trying to help guide them away from during the actual mediation session? It sounds like so much of what you're doing is framing the field so things can be more productive.
Well, yeah, a couple things, and they're really embedded in what we've been discussing. So whether or not we've had these pre-session conferences, sometimes in the mediation session, lawyers can't help themselves. They are position driven. They are showing off a bit, I hate to say it, for their client, or they think they are required to show off for their client. Or worst of all, they think it's important to convince me that they're right. So I am patient. I listen. I don't want to interrupt people. I don't, unless it gets out of control. I want to be respectful. But then I will, in my way, using some of the secret sauce that many of us have learned as mediators, steer the conversation to what really matters. What do you really need? I sometimes, and maybe this is a good note to end on, I sometimes will invoke the best summary I've ever heard, the best distillation of what an effective mediation is. And it comes from the Rolling Stones and my youth. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want, but if you try real hard, sometimes you just might get what you need. And that's where I try to steer people to constructive dialogue.
Steve, that's beautiful. And then to contradict the Rolling Stones, if you follow this process, you may just get some satisfaction. Thank you very much, Steve Bierman. This was a terrific presentation. If people are in a position and able to contribute to City Harvest Food Bank in New York City, that would be wonderful. We'll see you next week. And with that, we thank you once again. We are complete.